Welcome to Employee Termination Tips. My name is Christopher Neufeld of Neufeld Legal. And in this particular video, we'll discuss why one looks beyond termination pay that one has been offered by their former employer and the importance of doing so. And the first point we make with respect to termination pay in lieu of notice is that all too often termination pay is very easy to miscalculate. And as such, these miscalculations generally work against the employee, and they are in favor of the employer. And why is this? Well, in part it's because termination pay in lieu of notice is driven by statute, and the statutes are specific to the particular jurisdictions. So we get complex arrangements. And the problem is that termination pay in lieu of notice emanates in part from similar calculations to payroll. And the problem with payroll is there's a constant move to simplify payroll and to use the simplest process. And the problem with simplicity is that it takes away from all the component parts, in particular as you move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, because the larger jurisdictions tend to have the simplest forms of payroll. Such as Ontario tends to have the simplest form of payroll, and in part also has a simpler form of termination pay in lieu of notice as compared to the other provinces. And as such, especially if you're outside of Ontario but working in Canada, or if you're at the federal level subject to Canada Labor Code, it is very easy to have more complex calculations and those calculations not being treated properly, and thus underpayments arising with respect to termination pay in lieu of notice. Now, beyond that, one must remember that termination pay is the statutory minimum and typically needs to be coordinated with severance pay. So you have to look also at severance pay at the same time as you're looking at termination pay in lieu of notice. And what does this mean? Your calculation of severance pay, in effect, needs to be calculated in relative proximity to termination pay. And if the model for termination pay is underpaying, then what tends to happen is the outcome for severance pay also tends to be understructured. And then there's another aspect in that severance pay differs from termination pay, whereas termination pay is based on length of service dictated by statute. Severance pay is structured on a multiplicity of factors, with the ability to be reemployed one of the most important factors. And this is because it's a common law test. Multiple factors looked at, perceived by a judge, negotiated by the parties, but drawing upon a number of specifics that are specific to oneself. And then jumping back to termination pay. Even greater complexity involved. Even greater debate, negotiation, challenges, so on and so forth. But it all emanates in part from termination pay. When that's undercalculated, it provides the fired employee with leverage with which to work. But beyond that, it also leads to consideration of back pay and an analysis as to whether or not the former employee received all their earned pay. Because that is something that typically you don't do during the course of your employment, because what most employees are doing while they're employed is trying to retain their job, not trying to scrutinize and study their current pay and then challenge their employer. Because at that time, unless they have something decisively identified, they could very well be out of a job in very short order. Or when time comes to release people, they're the first person to be released. And instead, most employees would rather focus on retaining their job they're putting their job at risk. And as such, they don't scrutinize this stuff. And on top of it, most employees don't understand sufficiently how everything works, all the legalities, all the specifications, to be in a position to understand what their pay statements are saying, especially with so many pay statements missing key information, which makes it even more difficult for employees to understand what's being paid to them, such that it's only the time that they've been fired or otherwise let go from their job, even quit their job, that they're in a position to actually work with a lawyer who understands the stuff and actually scrutinize their past pay arrangement. And when we're scrutinizing past pay arrangements, we're talking about money that has legally been earned but has not been paid. And depending on the province, whether it's Ontario or Alberta, there are situations which arise where the entirety of the payments for however many years, well past the 2-year statute of limitations, are considered to be retained in trust by one's former employer and payable to the employee. And as such, it becomes particularly important to look at this because the money can be quite substantial. And this is what we term back pay. And it's another consideration in addition to termination pay in lieu of notice, in addition to severance pay, that needs to be looked at, that needs to be scrutinized. And while we're doing all this stuff, and we're seeing the complexities involved, we go on further because there are additional complexities that these reveal oftentimes, and this relates to pensions, whether it's defined contribution pensions or defined benefit pensions. And here too, there's a lot of specificity, legalities, and difficulties involved in this. And all too often, the simplified approach takes precedence because the simplified approach in many respects benefits the employer because it reduces the numbers, and by reducing the numbers, it reduces the amount of payout. Whether it reduces the payout that's coming from a defined benefit plan, or it reduces the number such that the contribution that's required by the employer in a defined contribution pension plan is lessened. In both circumstances, the employer benefits and the employee loses out. However, if you're entitled to money, you should have got paid that money. You should get paid that money. Remember, it's your pension. You worked for it. You earned it. And yet, because of the calculations, you're getting shortchanged. This is stuff that you have to investigate. And naturally, most people don't investigate it during the time that they're working because they're just trying to survive, retain their job, so on and so forth. But in the short window that you have immediately after you lose your job, that is a time where you need to protect your interests. Because much of this money you are legally entitled to because you've earned, or you have to negotiate for. But irrespective, it's money that should be due to yourself, whether by legal precedent or by statutory arrangement or by terms of pension agreement or otherwise. So consider this, look into it, pursue it correctly, and address it where appropriate with knowledgeable legal counsel who understand the law specific to your situation and your jurisdiction so you get what you are entitled to. Because it is your money and it is money that is due to yourself. And because of that, you need to be looking beyond simply the termination pay aspect, investigating, analyzing, and pursuing it aggressively. Thank you.